In this introduction to controls within AppForms video, we're going to take a look at the dynamic grid control. So the dynamic grid control in AppForms is very similar to the table view control in that you can populate the control with data from a backend data source and it will render the data in a tabular type view. However, one major difference between the dynamic grid and the table view control is that the data within the dynamic grid control is editable. So not only can you populate the grid with data, but you can also insert new data, update existing data, and delete records from the data source if needed. So let's take a quick look at the properties of the dynamic grid control. We'll go through those, then we'll take a look at populating the control with data, as well as how to go through and implement the various commands to update, insert, and or delete the data from the control. So if you select the dynamic grid control, the first thing you're going to notice under the general section again is the control name property, which again is just the unique name for the control. It has an allow paging property, which by default is unchecked. Basically what this controls is whether or not the control will break the data down into groups of records. So for example, if the paging is allowed, you can, and then the default page size is 255, but you can set this to whatever value you want. So for example, if I had set the page size to 10, then what it's going to do is show 10 records per page off the grid so that you can then page through, and then it would give you the next 10 records, the next 10, etc., until you reach the end of the record set. So for testing purposes, I'll set this to 5. Show header, if this is checked, then this will show the column headers within the dynamic grid control. If it's unchecked, then the column headers will not be present. Prevent new row. So you'll notice, as I mentioned, you can insert, update, and delete data. The dynamic grid control has this new row link or new row item here at the bottom of the control, the little plus sign. If you check this prevent new row property, then what this will do is disable this from showing, and the user will not be able to add new rows to the control. They can still update the data, but they can't add new items. The export property, this is similar to what we saw in the table view control, where you can select a type of file format that you want to export the data out, as. For example, CSV, XLS, XLSX, or OXLS. If this is selected to anything other than the none option, you will get a little Excel icon in the lower left-hand corner of the dynamic grid control, denoting that the data can be exported, and when you click the icon, that will begin the export process. So let me set this to just an XLS file, and I'll give it a file name of sample data. This just allows you to specify the file name for the exported data file. Build data trigger. This controls how the rule is going to be executed. You have 3 options. You can either select on completed, which is the default, and that will execute the rule once all of the data has been loaded into the control. There's on each cell, which will execute the trigger once for each cell of the data set. And then there's on each row, which will execute it once per row. So I'll demonstrate that in a moment. Right now, I'll just leave it to on completed. Dynamic height and width. This allows the control to dynamically adjust the height and width of the control to accommodate the data. If you check this, then you will get a max height property that you can then set to whatever size you want to limit the max height of the control to be. Link text. This property allows you to edit the value that's associated with the add new row link at the bottom. So by default it's add row. If you want to change this, you could say add new item or something like that. That will then replace this text when the control is loaded at runtime. Hide quick action buttons. When the form is loaded, the dynamic grid control has buttons which will appear to the right of the control for each row. There will be a plus sign and a minus sign. The plus allows you to quickly click it to add a new row so that you don't have to come over here and click this, and then the minus sign will allow you to delete the row that the button is currently located beside. So this property allows you to disable those buttons. We'll take a look at that in a moment, the difference. For now, I'll leave it unchecked. And then the check dirty property, which we've looked at before, but what this does again is if this is checked, then this allows you to be able to determine at runtime if the user has modified the data within the dynamic grid control using a rule. So I'll go ahead and check this, and we get a warning about this, so indicating that check dirty property for all the controls inside the grid will be considered as true. I'll click that. I've already got a button and a rule set up, so we can look at that here in a moment. The style properties for the grid, you have a width and a height that controls the width and height of the control. You have a margin property, which controls the spacing around the outer edge of the control. You can apply a box shadow if you like, visible property, and enable control whether the control is visible and or enabled at runtime. Column span, for this case I have it spanning the 4 columns of the grid. You can modify this as needed. Corner radius, if you want to add a rounded corner to the control, you can set this corner radius property. And then enable border. If you want to set a border around the outer edge, then you can also have the ability then to adjust the border thickness, the border style, and the border color if desired. Next set of properties associated with the control are the data source properties. So let me go ahead and set this up and at least configure it to load some data so that we can take a look at some of the properties. You have several options for the data source type: SQL, stored procedure, a RESTful service, or an Azure table. For the purpose of this demonstration, we'll use SQL Server. So I'll click the little ellipsis under the columns to configure the control. So again, I'll select MS-SQL, click OK. In this case, I'll select my Northwind database. I'm going to select the categories table for this test. I'll add these 3 fields. Here's our list of columns. If you need to edit either the column header, the width, whether the column is showing or not, the sorting, if you want to change the control type for that particular column, you could also edit that by clicking this pencil icon. If you want to delete the field from the dynamic grid, you can click the delete control here, the little trash can icon. You can also add custom columns to the dynamic grid if needed. All you need to do is simply specify the control name, the type, and the column header and width settings, and then click plus, and that will add these to the list. For this test, I want to simply create a select command, so we'll go ahead and just click add here. So I want to map the category ID to the TXT category ID field of the dynamic grid, category name to the TXT category name, and description to the TXT description field. Here you have the option of applying criteria or filter to the data. I don't want to do that at this point. You can add sorting if you'd like, so I'll just sort it by the category ID. And I would like for this to load when the form loads, so I'll check the form load option, and it'll add a trigger to that automatically. And then we click finish. While we're here, let's go ahead and set up the rule for the dynamic grid. So just drop down the little caret here and select create rule. I'm going to add 2 actions because I want to use this to show the trigger property that we talked about before. So I already have this trigger count variable that I previously created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize this, but if you didn't have it, you can simply just create one by clicking the create variable item here and then just type the name and click save variable. Since I already have it, I'll just utilize it here. What I want to do is, as the rule executes, I want to update the trigger count by 1. And then I have a label on the form, LBL trigger count. I want to set its value to the trigger count variable to be trigger count. So that's what I want to do with that. Now let's preview the form. So let's first look at the fill trigger property that we were talking about. So it is currently set to once completed. So basically that will execute one time after the data is loaded, and that's what's indicated by the count value of 1 here in the label. So no, it executed one time as per the setting of the property. So as you'll note, we loaded the data. Here we have our add new item text that we applied via the property setting. Here is our Excel icon that we can click on to export the data. So if I click that, it's now going to download the file that we named sample data. It's going to pin the date to it. And this is going to be downloaded to your downloaded files path for the current user. We have our data. Here is the, I have to adjust the width of the form. But notice here to the right is our quick action buttons. There's a plus and there is a minus. I'm going to have to adjust the width of the form so that we can see that. But they display here. So if I wanted to add a new row, I just click plus. So what happened, because I have paging enabled, is when I click the plus associated with this row for number 5, on the next page of record, you'll see it inserted a new record here. So it inserted it between record 5 and record 6. We'll make the form a bit wider. Let's preview that again. Okay, now it's a little more clear. So here are your quick action button items, plus and the minus. So if I go, again, because we didn't actually save those changes, we don't have the new records. So let me click add item again. Notice it adds to the end. If I go and hover on record 7 and click the plus sign, it will insert here. I can also click the minus sign and it'll remove the record as well. So you'll also notice that the paging has been applied, so 5 records per page. We have 2 pages in this case because we have 8 records. So our paging settings have been applied. And so now let's look at what changing some of these properties will do. I'm going to disable paging. I'll also change the trigger to be on each row. And I'm going to hide the quick action buttons. So now let's preview this. Okay, here again with our show header, here are our column headers. I forgot to mention that before, but our column headers are displayed. So you still have the add new item, but notice as I hover over each of the rows, I no longer get the quick action buttons displayed since we turned those off. And also we have no paging because we have disabled the allow paging, so we get all of the data returned into the grid. And if we were to have exceeded the visible area of the grid or the max height, then what would happen? We'd get a scroll bar to the right so that we could scroll the rest of the records that were loaded into the grid. Also notice that the label now is displaying a value of 8, so it executed once for each row so that we get a total of 8. I'm going to disable the show header for this test. And I'm going to change this to on each cell. I'll also check the prevent new row just to show you what that does. When you check the prevent new row, that will by default disable the hide quick action buttons property so that it can't be set. So notice we no longer have an add new row item, and we also have no quick action buttons here. Note that in this case, our count, because we ran it on each cell and there's 3 per row and 8 rows, we got 24. So that's where we get the 24 from. So it executed once for each cell of data that was loaded. If I change something in the data grid, if I run check dirty, now it is true. So I've modified the data in one of the columns, and that has now marked the control as dirty. So now let's look at how you can utilize the commands for the dynamic grid to allow you to insert, update, and delete data. So what I want to initially do is I want to modify the select command. I'm going to apply a filter where category ID is equal to txt search value, which is a text box that I have on the form. I'm also going to add an insert command, which will allow me to add new data to the record set. We simply have to map the fields from the record source to the fields in the dynamic grid. And once we do that, and in this case, we don't need to map the category ID field because it is an auto number field in the underlying SQL Server table. So it will automatically add a value, so we don't need to set that. That's why I don't map it in this case. And I will execute this command, the insert command, on the BTN submit button that I've got on the form. We also add an update command, which again is very similar. Mapping the fields. Again, because it's an auto number, I'm not going to be changing it in the update, so I'm not going to map it. I'm going to again map the category ID to whatever the value of my txt search value control is. And we'll execute that from the BTN update button. And lastly, I'll also add a delete command. In this case, all I need to really map is the ID to denote which record I'm going to delete. And that will execute on the BTN delete button. So now I've configured all of my data modification commands. I have a select command to load the data, an insert to add new records, an update to modify the existing record, and a delete to delete the specific record. So let's just click finish. So now the last thing I need to do is I need to add a rule to the select button. So that it executes the select command based on the value I typed into the text box control, and I want to disable the command from executing when the form loads. So now let's preview the form. Okay, notice we have no records currently loaded within the dynamic grid, so I'll just type in a category ID that I know exists. Okay, so we return back that record. Now let's say I want to add a new record. So I won't need to populate category ID because it's an auto number field. So I'll just type something like junk food for the category and something here for the description. So now I'll submit this to write this new record back. So moved off of that record. So I think this should be record 13 as it is. Okay, so here's our new record that we added. So now we need, let's say we want to change this to so now we've modified the record. Let's say we want to save these changes, so I'll just click update. Let me move off of this record. And now I'll move back. And notice it has saved our changes. And now if I want to delete this record, I need to first hover over the record and get the quick action menu. Click the minus to delete the record. And then click the delete to actually commit that back to the server. Now if I move off of the record and try to go back, there is no record for category ID 13. So we have deleted the record. There's one other thing I'd like to demo with regard to the dynamic grid control. So let me set up a data source for this second control that we have. I'm going to again bind it to SQL Server, Northwind database. In this case, I'm going to select the employees table. Select a few fields. Okay, so here again we have our field list of the fields that we've selected where it's customizable. So I'm going to, for example, put first name before last name, and I'll move title of courtesy to the top. I'll just make it title. I'll shorten this for the sake of test, and then we'll make these a bit smaller because they're not containing that much data. So notice that the wizard has automatically taken a couple of the fields, the birth date and hire date, which it's determined and recognized based on the data type of the field in the underlying table to be date fields. It's associated them with a date time picker. So you can, within the dynamic grid, actually specify and utilize different control types nested within the dynamic grid control. So again, we've got date time pickers associated with the two date fields. Most of these are going to be text boxes, but I know this photo path is actually URL. It's a hyperlink URL to a site. So what I want to do for it is, rather than displaying it in a text box, I'm going to make it utilize a hyperlink button so that I can click on the hyperlink and navigate to it. Let me click X here. So all you have to do to modify it is if you click the pencil icon, which is the edit control icon associated with the column, you can then change the control type to one of these particular control types, whichever one would be utilized best. So notice you've got autocomplete text box, checkbox, combo box, composite column, date time picker, file upload, etc. So in this case, I want to select the hyperlink button. And then that's all I really want to change about it. So just wanted to make you aware that you do have the flexibility of changing these control types if you need to or would like to do so. So I'll go ahead and click next. We'll set up a select command for this. And now I have to go through and map the fields. I don't want to apply a filter. I don't care about sorting either. So we'll have this run on, or have the data loaded on form load. Let me preview the form. Okay, so notice we have it took the changes to the column names, or column headers rather. It's also shrunk the column width a bit. Now here's what I want to notice. So for the birth date and the hire date, notice they are full featured date time picker controls. So you can click on that, it'll load the date time picker control so that you can use that to select the date that you'd like to add. And then if we scroll to the end, our photo path is a hyperlink button. You can click on it. Now these links don't appear to be valid, but again, if you had a valid hyperlink, then you can use that to then navigate to the URL for that link. That concludes the properties and demo for the dynamic grid control. I hope that you found this video beneficial. Please view our other AppForms training videos for more in-depth tutorials regarding AppForms, as well as our how-to videos that show you how to implement various tasks within your AppForms solutions. Thank you.